Greg Wallace. His better half is somewhere in the house, and also Michael Keith. Both these gentlemen are short fiction writers. Actually, Michael is a very, very short fiction writer, microfiction. Greg is an educator, was an educator, retired now, an administrator, and novel, the author of several collections. The one we're discussing today is Everyone, and Michael Keith is a professor of communications at Boston College, a virtual one, I guess, and he's the author of Insomnia 11. He does a lot of, he's had a number of books out, both about communications, the radio industry, and also a lot of books of fiction that have come out in recent years. So I'm going to speak to him about their books, and then also about the troubles that we're having publishing in the pandemic era, because both of these gentlemen have had these issues. So what I've read from your work, you both have a habit of making the banal bizarre, I would have to say. Would you comment on that, Michael or Greg?
Yeah, I think most authors, I think that's a challenge. You make the banal bizarre, or humorous, or mysterious, or whatnot. I just have a predisposition to the bizarre, I guess. I think having read a number of Greg's stories, he also has kind of a predisposition for the bizarre, certainly never banal. It's just, I guess a lot of it has to do with what you've read in your life, as well as where you're at in your life. At this point in my life, I think being older than 39, I kind of look at life in a crooked, if not a little bit convoluted way. And that obviously manifests in what I do and what I write.
Like a granddad suffering from cancer and asking his son to come in with a gun and just saying he wants to clean it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
That was heartwarming, actually. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. How about you, Greg?
Yeah, something similar works for me. I mean, I've mentioned, I think last time I was with you, that most of my work is premised on Kafka's notion that a literary work should be an ice axe to break up the frozen sea inside us. So that's often what I'm aiming toward. And while I take relatively normal situations, I will work with magic realism, but the word realism is in magic realism. So the realism there is adapted into what the characters would perceive as their common reality.
But I know both of you. I know Mike's background as a kid. He wrote a memoir about that. And it was quite bizarre. He was in rooming houses and met all these kind of characters. I know in my own poetry, I've worked in a mental hospital for many years before I started teaching, and so I've met all kinds of people. How about you, Greg? Up there in upstate New York, gets a little strange.
Well, actually, I'm a Long Island boy like yourself, so my formative years were spent on Long Island. But I would credit in my earliest reading, I would credit Dr. Seuss and the strange worlds he created for a couple of things. One, my love of language, meter and rhyme, etc. But also for stories like On Beyond Zebra, where the alphabet is extended beyond the premise of the book is that the alphabet is extended beyond, or McGilligot's Pool, where who knows what we could catch, what strange fish exist in this what appears to be just a tiny little pool. So that, and the fact that I had older brothers who would do things like, when I was 9 or 10, gift me with books like Jorge Luis Borges's Ficciones, and say, here, sit down, read this, you'll get a kick out of it. So my appreciation of the bizarre, I think, results from some of that early reading. Plus, mundane reality was kind of boring to float through and always has been. So if you want to see, if you want things to be, to me, to be interesting and stimulating, you set common things against each other, which I like to do, and see what happens. And sometimes it's interesting, and if it's not, then I don't use it in the fiction.
I take, as Greg takes his cue from Kafka, I take my cue from Dylan Thomas, his famous poem in the opening stanza that goes, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should shout and rave at day's end."
Rage, wasn't it?
Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Right.
And I do that. That's mostly what I do in the short pieces that I write. I'm sorry, go ahead, Greg.
No, go ahead. I was going to say, I find it interesting that reading over Insomnia 11 and also your other works, Mike, that age is a frequent theme or motif. And I mention it because I find that in the last few years, I've started to write more stories, less from the perspective of young dads than from retirees and older folks. And it's kind of a change. And when we talk about what gets published and what doesn't get published, that might be an interesting theme to break up to see if we're being aged out.
Yeah.
Well, I think,
and of course, I remember a little story. It was you had one where a girl was compelled to put a swastika on her knee.
Yes, that's what I did my last reading. Yep, that was a younger dad, widower who had her background was that her great grandfather had been a Nazi, and she was offered the scar on her knee. She made a scar print out of it by inking it and in school as her own way of doing a classroom project. And
I guess she needs a knee replacement.
Well, eventually the story mentions that the dad had been told that there would be some surgery to correct that in the future, but he didn't know she had a swastika-shaped scar on her knee until that moment in the principal's office.
Yeah.
Now, you write short fiction, a lot of it, Greg, and you do microfiction. And so I'd imagine, reductionism for you, Mike, particularly, is it difficult? Because it's like a poem. Every word has to count. You don't have, like, if you're writing a novel or something, you can.
I think it's, maybe the more literary term for it is prose poetry. I think the fewer words that I can use and still convey something that has poignancy and power, the happier I am. And that therein lies the challenge. Oftentimes I'll end up with something that's a full page, and I'll not be happy with it. And I'll go back and look at it and see that it's probably the first sentence that the real gem or the power or the ping of it exists. And then I'll just slash everything up to that point. I did that this morning. I wrote a piece this morning, and it was a full 200 words. And I wasn't happy with it. And I looked at it and I realized in the first two short sentences, there it was. And so, yeah, reductionism, I guess you can, is a good term. Epigrammatic is, I think, probably appropriate too. But that's what I like to do. I mean, I've written a lot of actual full-length short stories. It's only in the last couple of books that I've come to the micro fiction, the micro story, and I found that in those I probably come closer to achieving a literary level than I have in anything else. Maybe it's Coward's Way Out. Maybe the idea that I can do really good work if I keep it brief, and maybe that's what I'm doing.
Greg,
Mike,
have
you
you,
used, oh, I just wanted to say, Mike used a term that I think is sort of extra literary, but he and I throw it around a lot now when we discuss his work, and you might want to explain it, Mike. You wait for the ping. And
Yeah.
I think that's the crux of your work, so you might want to explain that.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I can explain it that effectively either. I look for a story to convey truth, and I look for a story to convey truth quickly. And if I can do that, it's a ping. It just strikes a note, and the note is sharp and clean and vivid, and I think something's achieved there. I think it's easy to write long. It's not easy to write good and long. Greg writes good and long. When I go back and look at my earlier collections, they strike me more as journalism than literature. And that's not what I wanted to achieve. But now I see that I'm able to more closely achieve the literary in the short work, especially if it pings.
Greg, Greg, have you written novels at all?
No, and it's interesting because I have, but they arrive in sort of a backwards way. Just very quickly, my compositional process is sort of like Mike's, except I write a lot first. Like if I was going to write a 20-page story, which is sort of like the going length these days, and it's what I aim towards. It's my 14-line sonnet is a 5,000-word short story. I'll start off with 40 pages and then continue to rewrite the story over and over and over again until I get it down. I might rewrite a story 15 or 20 times and even and definitely will not have a single sentence survive the original writing. I like that process. I like to get rid of characters. When I find the heart of the story, that's when I can sharpen it. So I'll write a lot and then shorten. So I have written longer, but in regard to novels, I have a few that I'm actually pushing now, but the novels and have out, but my novels tend to be more like collections of short stories that have interlocking characters. And as I rewrite the novels, the object is to make them seem less like short stories that I said, oh, that was an interesting character. Let me write a story about this other guy in the story, or let me examine another aspect of this character's life in another short story. So I'll have several short stories that are about the same characters or the same settings or involve the same situations. And because it feels more like a novel than just a collection of linked stories, I'll try to compose a novel out of what were originally short stories. So I'll do that, and I haven't had the success with the novels that I've had with the short stories, I'll say that, in terms of marketing.
What's that?
I say in terms of marketing, I haven't had the success with novels that I've had with short stories.
Now, both of you, we've all been having problems, getting things, published and even mailed out because of all the stuff that's going on now during this coronavirus and everything. So maybe you guys could talk a bit about your trials and travails that you've experienced. And I'm sure it's universal. I'm sure it's just not you guys.
Yeah, I think it is. Relating it to myself with Insomnia 11, it was first to come out in April, and everything was done. The galleys were done, the jacket was done, everything, and then we were in the thick of the pandemic, and then it was to come out in May. Now it's in June, and I haven't seen it. I don't have a hard copy of it. I don't know when I'm going to see it. And when I contact Mad Hat says, well, his wholesaler and distributor says that they're 22 days behind. The delivery services are weeks behind. and he's frustrated, but he says, you know, what can I do? There's just nothing I can do. So there, and he has a half dozen other authors whose books were supposed to publish a month, 2 or 3 months ago, and you know, they're up on the site. They have an ISBN. They exist, but they just don't exist in a hard copy form yet. And we're still, you know, it's like having a phantom book.
Do you have Kindle at all?
Yeah, well, I have the galley. I have an electronic.
No, but you have an. You could still put it up as a Kindle book too. You know.
Yeah, he said, but you know, it didn't seem that made a heck of a lot of difference. The people who have ordered the book want the hard copy, and so it's just a waiting game. I know that other publishers have experienced difficulties too. I mean, they have their books done and they're at their distributors. My book is at Ingram, which is one of the biggest distributors, and probably because it's so big, it's, you know, it's so stacked up in getting things out. It's, you know, it's very, very frustrating for both the author and the publisher.
Okay, Greg.
Yeah, well, I've had an interesting case with this collection, Dear Everyone. I've had no trouble ordering copies myself, and they're available through, well, now through Wellesley Books is the best way to get them, through Wellesley Books. They're also available through the publisher, which is Duck Lake Books, but therein lies a tale. A few weeks ago, I got a message from another of Duck Lake Books authors who asked me if I knew if the publisher himself was doing well, if he was sick or ill or whatever, because he couldn't contact the publisher. The publisher gives a separate book for ordering, so everyone I know who's tried to order up through last week has been able to get copies of the book. Duotrope recently listed the publisher as defunct, so he's satisfying the books, publication of the books that have already been published, but he seems to have stopped publishing anything he was in the middle of. That's the state of the small book publisher right now. I mean, the books publishers, the stores are struggling. I'm doing the best I can to support the small bookstores through ordering through them as best I can. But so if anyone out there wants to order, they should order through the bookstore or the publisher, the independent publishers, instead of through Amazon. I would
you get a lot, because Amazon takes a lot of money. At
the same time, Mad Hat Press is taking orders, but they're just unable to respond as you might expect. In a week or so, you get the book. I think some people have waited 2 months so far to get the book, and Lord knows it might be another 2 months, or it could be tomorrow. Who knows?
You know, Greg, you brought up an interesting thing about ageism in publishing. You said you're starting to experience that. I know you and I are around the same age. Mike is younger, but what's been your experience?
Well, there's nothing I can prove. So, but right. I do know that it's many of the publishers the editors of the journals I submit to are younger. They're university students. There's the university journals, which take a lot of the short story, and a lot of the better opportunities for publishing short stories are through the university or college journals. They have great reputations, but their editors are young. They're graduate students often, sometimes even undergraduate students assume the roles, or the readers are undergraduates, and they don't necessarily, or they're not necessarily interested in the same subjects as older folks. I find that if I can usually tell, and then my research indicates that I was right, when a story gets snapped up pretty early on in the process of my submitting it, say, oh, it was someone who's been around for a long time, or someone who's more experienced, who has a wider range of interests, let's say, than someone younger might, who, you know, through no fault of their own, are interested in the things that are going on right around them in their own worlds. So it's, you know, I wouldn't say they're directly not accepting stories by older folks. It's just that thematically they have different interests.
Okay.
And while I know you guys are in your late middle age, I'm in my early old age. So, but everything that Greg says, I think, rings very true.
Okay. Any specific examples for you can present, Mike?
In terms of my, well, you know, an interesting thing, I published my memoir with Algonquin, now 17 years ago, and I was a young guy in my 50s at the time, but I could tell that the mainstream, the large commercial presses, wanted to publish younger authors. You know, maybe it's just more photogenic, maybe it's their effort to try to reach a more youthful audience. But I sensed then that I was really on the cusp maybe of being too old to find a mainstream commercial, large commercial press. And I was thinking of that just this morning when I thought I dallied about doing a sequel to The Next Better Place, and I thought, I'm in my 70s. Who the hell is going to, you know, be interested in a follow-up to?
Yeah, but I mean, when I was teaching, when I was using your memoir in class, the kids were very interested in it, and they certainly, this was just a few years ago.
Yeah, I don't think the audience has a problem. I think
it's a publisher.
Yeah, it's a publisher. You know.
Yeah, but if the publisher knows that an audience should know through marketing that a young
audience, they should know a lot of things. They just don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's also, at least with an agent, let's say we're always looking for agents who, that's a different issue too, that's worthy of discussion. Like agents for poets or short story writers are few and far between. But the idea is the same as for marketing purposes. Wouldn't you, if I were a business person, I'd rather sign a young person who perhaps has 5 or 6 or 7 more novels in them that could be groomed, rather than someone who wrote one thing and is no longer doesn't have the energy or the lifespan to write much more. That's going to be marketable. It has a lot to do with the market, I think.
Okay.
What they can sell and what they can look forward to selling in the future.
Now, you guys, I always like to have people read a bit from their work. If you know, Mike, I know you have short pieces. Perhaps Greg, you could read an excerpt or something like that from a short story. Who wants to go first? Mike, why don't you just read us a few pieces?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, maybe I'll read you some of the pings.
Yeah, and this is the from Insomnia 11 by the Mad Hat Press.
I'm reaching for my pings over here on my desk. So off camera for a second. Here I am. I'm back with you. All right, so a few pings, because I know we're limited for time. I was going to read longer pieces, but I'll read real short pieces. This is called Hungry for Love. Sarah knew it was the only time she'd have dinner with the man sitting across from her when he said, "You enjoy your food, don't you?" This is called April 47th. April 47th. Everything changes when you're dead. This is called Decision. Decision. He wondered if he'd willingly die in the place of his son. He thought it was asking a lot. This is called Obit. 47-year-old Harvey Sampson lost his fight with cancer on October 16th. His assailant remains at large. This is called Cotillion of the Fittest. It wasn't 3 days after the last human died that the cockroaches and rats held a dance. This is called aged non sequitur, aged non sequitur. He would have been 80 today if he hadn't died at 76. And finally, this is called canine IQ. She knows she can't fly, so when birds taunt her from the trees, she ignores them. Those are my pings.
I need the, yeah, I can see where they have pings to them. I mean, it's almost like in a way, you're like a stand-up comedian in some ways, you know?
Yeah, I did a reading Friday night, and after the reading, and I did a lot more of these, one of the questions from the audience was, do you do stand-up, comedian stand-up? Because it sure sounds like that's something you would do. No, I've never done stand-up. I've never thought about it.
Okay.
And these are the real short ones.
Okay, Mr. Wallace.
Yes, sir. First of all, here's the cover of my book, which is taken from a painting collage by Mike's wife, Suzanne Riette Keith. And I saw the painting and I said, what a lovely painting. That would make a great cover for my book. And through process, so it is. The story I'm going to read from, I'm just going to read the beginning of it, is one of the few stories I've written that is actually based, at least the part I'm going to read, based on an actual event. And it's without alteration into the world of the bizarre. The story is called Iota, which is the name of the main character's dog. This is to be the final day at the old house. The deal had been struck. The walkthrough is tomorrow, the closing the day after. As Gifford exits the front door to give Iota the dachshund her last walk on the property, he floats in a thin slice of time between nostalgia and the exhilarating potential of a new life. He and the dog will be the last of the family to vacate the house. Val awaits her husband in a condo minutes away from their daughter's home in the suburbs of a grand city 200 miles east. Few of their friends remain in the old neighborhood, and Gifford and Val are eager to follow their daughter and assume the roles of doting grandparents. Iota's belly drags on the grass Gifford is no longer responsible for mowing. Usually, there's no need to leash her. Even with Gifford's achy knees, she can't out-waddle him. But the new condo has strict rules about dogs being leashed at all times, and Val has insisted that Iota practice. Gifford studies the 13-year-old dog. She'll probably be their last pet. He can't imagine himself training a frisky pup, and he and Val have plans to travel. Say goodbye to the yard, kiddo, Gifford says, but nearsighted Iota stares up at her master instead, as if she senses he's considering life without her. Gifford looks away, letting his own gaze sweep unsentimentally across the grass, through the oak trees to the sparkle of the river. Preparing to move has been exhausting, and all his nostalgia has been sacrificed to Lance the Junk Man, or packed away in Rubbermaid tubs. It's all over but the shouting, Gifford tells the dog. He turns his back, closing this chapter of his life. They amble back toward the front porch. The flowers their broker suggested bloom along the side of the house, and honeybees rise and fall among the blossoms. Crows nag from the neighbor's roof, and white cabbage butterflies dance raggedly across the driveway. A bee zips by his face, as startling as a bullet, and Gifford sniffs, then smirks. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Come on, Ali, he says to Iota. But after a few more steps, another bee shoots by, and this time Gifford ducks. Then 3 more honeybees, then dozens streaming from his house. And there they gather, a mass of bubbling gold on the freshly stained cedar shakes. He leans forward for a closer look. A few late arriving bees circling him like miniature planets. One by one, the insects wriggle into a tiny hole between the shingles. Panic flushes Gifford's cheeks and temples. This is a swarm. These bees have followed a queen that's probably already in the walls of the house establishing a hive. Now? With buyers set to examine the house in the morning? At the hardware store, Gifford asks the young woman assisting him for the most powerful wasp-killing spray on the market, afraid that if he mentions endangered honeybees, she'll insist he contact an agency that will safely remove the swarm from his house, an option he would gladly take if he had the time. But this is an emergency. He'd already risked being stung when he plugged the hole between shingles with a stick, and in his basement, he'd discovered dozens of bees crawling over the cinder block walls and concrete floors. How many more were burrowed in the insulation? In a 60-minute mad rush, Gifford purchases, transports, and empties 10 cans of spray and 1 container of quick-dry hole-plugging cement. Sweeping up the carcasses of 100 bees occupies another quarter of an hour. 5 more minutes to set up fans that blow the fumes out the basement windows. All told, in less time than it takes to watch a movie, Gifford eradicates a new queen's empire. And that's the passage I'll read because it goes in a different direction after that.
This is a true story, you said.
This happened, yes, and interestingly enough, a former student of mine who is interested in entomology and using bugs and insects as food has made quite a study of it and a practice of it, and has actually taught how to do this throughout the world, and is now a journalist. Just sent me an article today in protest, because she's read the collection and read the story, sent me an article today saying, you can get that done. You can get a swarm moved if you try, but we knew that, but we literally had one day, and the next, after living in a house for 28 days, the swarm decided to enter the house, penetrate the house, invade the house the day before the buyers were going to do their walkthrough.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Do you have any readings coming up, virtual readings or anything? Or I would say, can people buy your books, but they can't.
Well, they can.
Well, they can.
Oh, they can buy it. They can buy it. Pre-order it.
Wellesley Books for mine.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But they can pre-order your book, right, Mike?
Yeah. At Mad Hat Press, pre-order it.
Okay.
And we both have reading, at least Mike has lots of reading, but we have one with the Trevena Barva celebration, because I have a third collection coming out with them sometime in 2021.
Was that all about men, or what is it?
So we'll be reading with them in July.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I have one.
That one is the collection to Women of Consequence. A lot of the stories were almost diptychs when they were first conceived, with stories in the first collection.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on Poet to Poet, Writer to Writer.